The middle game is usually part of a chess game where beautiful kingside attacks are created. This is where strategic plans are put into action and preparations for the endgame are quietly and sometimes secretly being demonstrated. And it is also true that pawn structures play a big role in having a superior middle game play over the opponent. In this video, we'll talk about one of the most common structures in almost every opening, the isolated pawns. An isolated pawn is created when no other friendly pawn is on an adjacent file. This lonely guy can't be touched or defended by any of its brothers, and as a result, it becomes vulnerable to attack by enemy pieces. Okay, I believe many people think isolated pawns are a weakness, and we can't deny the fact that there will be times we can't resist just having one. Or maybe there will be times or many games where we notice our opponent has one or few of these pawns. Now the question is, are we prepared to, handle this kind of isolated pawns? Do we have the valuable know-how to play alongside ISO pawns? First, how do we punish our opponent when they have isolated pawn? How should we label it as weakness and take advantage of it? If your opponent has an isolated pawn, first try to check if you can obstruct it. In other words, make sure it can't move forward by taking control of the square directly in front of it. You know, a moving target is hard to hit, whereas a target that's stuck in one place is easy to aim at. In this part of the game, white is making a strong case in facing black's isolated D pawn head on. White is not just guarding the entire D file with his queen and his rook, but he also keeps an eye on the d4 square. And that is because this open diagonal bishop and the knight on e2 guarding that square. Therefore, it prevents black's d pawn from moving forward. In the game, white played the most obvious move, rook to c5, attacking the isolated pawn. And let me go back. Many inexperienced players might be tempted to immediately play, knight to d4, as that d4 square looks perfect outpost for a knight. But after knight to e5, there is a tempo there attacking white's queen and jumping that black knight going into the c4 square, improving its position. And instantly, it equalizes black's game there and there. So let me go back to the rook to c5 move. So after rook to c5, this is in fact the better move there. Remember, the pawn there that is being attacked by the rook on c5 is stuck as it can't move forward. So black played knight to e7. And after knight to f4, that pawn right there is doomed. Second, occupy the square in front of that isolated pawn. In the previous game, it was not possible to occupy the square in front of that enemy isolated pawn because of the knight to e5 attack on the queen, remember? But in this game, quite similar position to the previous one, white still controls the square in front of black's isolated pawn. And other than directly attacking it, occupying the square in front of it could be a great idea. In this game, white played knight to d4. And it shows that white's control over d4 stops the d-isolated pawn and gives white's knight a very nice home. Number 3. Offer to exchange pieces. Well, in logic, an advanced isolated pawn, for example, white's pawn on d4 or black's pawn on d5, etc., gains space and makes its pieces rather active. The side playing against the isolated pawn should exchange all the minor pieces whenever possible. Let's put it this way. They can't get active if they are not on the board. In this game, black just played a rook to d7, removing his rook from the pin on the dark squares there. Many players might play f3 next, and that is to prevent knight to e4, and that is an almost automatic reasoning, right? However, if we analyze this position closely, we wanted to take advantage of our opponent's weakness, and that is his isolated d-pawn. So as the knight there in f6, being one of the most active defenders of that weakness keeps on making active plays or counter plays, it is better to completely get rid of it when we have the chance rather than just controlling its squares. So the better move is actually bishop takes f6. In fact, white has followed all three steps. First, he has taken control of the square in front of that pawn. He has occupied that square in front of that isolated pawn and exchanged all of the minor pieces. And he has doubled on it and forced the remaining black units to take up a defensive stance. So black recaptures with his queen, queen takes f6, and now white wins the pawn after, queen to d2 attacking the pawn in d5, and after queen to e6, there is e4 when the pin along the d file doesn't give black a way to save his pawn. Okay, how about if for some reasons we get to own an isolated pawn? Should we feel bad throughout the game? Bow our heads and lose our confidence in winning? Well, not at all. If you happen to own an isolated pawn, do this. Number one, push it. When you have the chance to eliminate that weakness of yours at the expense of creating a weakness to your opponent in return, do it. In this game, black owns an isolated b pawn. And the good thing is, this pawn is at least not sitting in an open file. But still, if black is not careful, white could play b4, knight to d4, rook c5, and attack that weakness. Now, but in this game, black knows what he's doing. So he played b4. That way, he gets rid of his isolated pawn and use it as a battering ram. And after making a pawn trade, so white can just push, ignore that pawn trade and just push, right? Because there's rook guarding that square. So after the exchange of pawns, queen takes b4. Now it turns out that white's healthy majority pawn turned into a weak isolated pawn of its own. And now this b2 pawn will be a weakness for the rest of the game. Now the situation is reversed and black is ready to target that weakness of his enemy for the rest of the game. Number 2. Protect important squares. In this game, black owns an unfortunate isolated d-pawn. And even though it appears to be a weakness in his side, it gives compensation as black has the more active minor pieces than his opponent. He's got the better knights, closer to the center and ready to maneuver when needed to, than white's active knight and somehow passive bishop. I'd like to make a point that in general, even isolated pawns, if centrally placed, can be useful. So it's important to note that here, black's isolated pawn is guarding some key squares on e4 and c4. Therefore, after white's attempt to exchange the minor pieces in the center with knight to d4, black will not just easily exchange those minor pieces, but rather will play knight to d6 instead, to maneuver his knights to one of those squares, the e4 and c4. And few moves, minor pieces for black are more superior than his opponent. Number 3. Progress it. Did you know that far advanced isolated pawns can also become dangerous? Well, if a player manages to move it forward, it could become a dangerous passer, especially in the endgame. In this game, white pushes his f-pawn forward for two primary reasons. Number 1, so that the rook on f1 can gain access to f7, and that is a major weakness on black's king side. Number 2, so that the exchange of pawns on e6 would allow white's own isolated pawn to become a dangerous passer. So if after e takes f5, then rook takes f5, this is white activating his rook, and white's isolated pawn becomes a strong passer. Now, if black ignores after f5 and just play e5, still, it's going to be the same direction for white. So after e5, white still produces that same pass pawn, and either directions, white has the better position and advantage. And now we have a rook behind pass pawn here, and this passer is going to be dangerous as the endgame takes place. Alright, I have here a simple puzzle that will test our knowledge about isolated pawns. We just discussed about handling isolated pawns in the middle game. Now, I wanted to give a little twist, and this time it's in the end game. Here, black is down 2 pawns. He's got 2 isolated pawns there, and that are in tension with, white's queenside pawns. And white has secured the G file, rather. So the king is ready to support that advancement of that G pawn. Now, but black to move here snatches the win for white. Can you try to find the best move for black? You can pause the video and come to think of it. Alright, thank you for your answers. If you found the move c4, then you must be in another level of chess. After c4, white loses control of black's a pawn. Now, as the a4 square is not covered anymore, and its progress is just too far for white to cope up to. So, if there's an exchange of bishop first, and that would not help white anymore, because this pawn is forced to take this pawn, and after this a4 move, this passer is unstoppable. That isolated pawn decides the game for black. For other moves, any other moves, for example, b takes a5, still after c takes b3, and this black's king is within the rule of the square, and it catches this pass pawn of white, and his own pawn is going to birth a queen. If you learned something in this lesson, feel free to like and share this video to your friends. And don't forget to apply it to your games.
Hey, check this video out to make sure that you get more important information to bring your chess to the next level.